Hey, Philosophy 101 class. I apologize for the slight lateness of this lecture. I wanted to give everybody as much of a chance as possible to submit the part 2 of their short answers, which of course asked you whether or not you would like to include the COVID-19 virus in our continuing discussions. We had already planned to discuss ethics essentially until the end of the semester. So this doesn't actually represent a change in scheduling or anything, although we might include some political philosophy if we do end up talking about COVID-19. So about 2/3 of you have submitted your short answers. A lot of you didn't follow instructions because it was a yes or no question. And some people did not actually end up saying the words yes or no. But that's okay. I'm not going to make a big deal out of that. I just found it kind of funny. So the results are in based on about 2/3 of you all. One class overwhelmingly 100% said yes, you are interested in including COVID-19 in our ongoing discussions. And another class, one person said no, they weren't interested, but they didn't particularly care, and another person actively expressed disinterest. So far, that's 2 no's to about 40 yeses. So I think it's obvious I'm going to have to, we need to include this. A lot of you wrote really interesting explanations that I took the time to read, and I'm inclined to agree with you that this is a way to make philosophy very relevant to our lives. So we are going to be including it. I have not made up my mind yet whether or not any assignments will be based on it. It does seem unfair to so dramatically change our schedule to those who were not interested in discussing it as to create an assignment specifically for it. If we do end up doing that, those of you who are not interested will be given an alternate assignment that just deals with the general questions of ethics, which we're definitely going to go over. So if you check your syllabus, you'll see that we are moving on to metaethics now. So there are, I typed up some stuff in advance for your notes, but let's start out here. Oh, well, not in the middle of the page, hopefully. There are 3 types of ethics, let's call it, in philosophy. So there's applied ethics. This is like, okay, so our possible discussions of COVID-19, right? What should we do right now? What is the right thing to do in this specific? I mentioned bioethics, so not why, I'm sorry. Bioethics asks what sorts of so that's just an example. Bioethics would be a kind of applied ethics. It asks what sorts of obligations should physicians have to their patients, right? So like, for example, if a physician knows that somebody has a religious belief that doesn't allow them blood transfusions, does the physician have the right to override that patient's desire for themselves in that specific situation. Maybe the patient is unconscious or cannot consent, or maybe the physician doesn't know what beliefs this person has, and the person is unconscious, so they cannot possibly answer any questions about what sort of beliefs they may or may not have. What should that specific physician do in that specific situation? That's applied ethics. So if we move up the ladder a little bit, there's normative ethics. It would help if there was an E in there. There's normative ethics. So normative ethics asks something like, what system should we use to determine what is right and what is wrong? So normative ethics attempts to create a system that we can then use in our applied ethics. So maybe some of you have heard of utilitarianism. This is a kind of some of you mentioned that you watched The Good Place. So a lot of what is in The Good Place is they'll mention a normative ethical system, and then they'll try to use it for applied ethics, right? So what would utilitarianism tell one of the characters in The Good Place to do in that specific situation? Also, if you watch The Good Place, you might have heard of deontology. Is also a normative, oh my goodness, it's so hard to talk and type out loud. Deontology is also a normative system. Deontology is rules-based, so utilitarianism looks at the consequences of an action to determine if you should take that action or not. That's its system. Deontology attempts to make a set of rules and doesn't really worry about the consequences. It's always wrong to lie, for example, might be a rule that deontology has. And you're like, okay, that sounds pretty good, but then what if you're the family who hid Anne Frank and her family in their attic during World War II? And a Nazi came and knocked on the door, and they're like, hey, have you seen any Jewish people? Deontology is possibly not going to be so concerned with the consequences of telling the truth or of lying. Of course, which would be at the time that Anne Frank and her family were discovered and would die horribly at the hands of Nazis. So utilitarianism would say, well, yeah, obviously lie. That produces the best outcome. Whereas deontology would say, no, lying is always wrong. That's a rule. We're not worried about the consequences. There's more to it than that, but the title of the section we're in right now is Metaethics, not normative ethics. So let's not get too bogged down in that. There's also something called divine command theory. Religious people tend to combine some sort of divine command theory with utilitarianism. We might talk a little about the Euthyphro dilemma, which asks the question of divine command theorists, does God say that something's wrong because he knows it's wrong, like he looks at the world and sees that it's wrong and says, okay, so don't do that because that would be the wrong thing to do? Like, is wrongness a fact in the universe that deity discovers and then passes on to his followers? Or is it wrong because a deity has said it is wrong? So, and I'll try to change gender terms here. I know it bothers some people that we always say he. So, is something wrong because you're God? I guess I can't use gendered pronouns at all. Is something wrong because your God decided it was wrong? Right? your God deciding that something wrong then confer onto that activity wrongness. So if your deity said eating ice cream on Wednesdays is wrong, and that then got passed down to you, and you were like, ah, my word, God has commanded it. Does eating ice cream on Wednesdays then gain the property of wrongness because it was commanded? Divine command theory is going to say, yes, that's how it works. God does not discover wrongness that exists out there in the universe. It is wrong because God said so, and for no other reason than that. We're not going to look a lot at divine command theory, but it is a normative system of ethic, right? You would look at that system and then apply it to your specific situations. So anyway, there are a couple others. There's virtue ethics, which I think somebody specifically mentioned wanting to talk about. I'm not a huge fan of virtue ethics, but these are all normative systems. They're systems for determining what is right and what is wrong that we then apply in applied situations. And last but not least, my personal favorite is metaethics. Right? You know what? I'm just tired of my own programs telling me the thing I studied in school is not a word. Okay. So third is metaethics. Oh, what was that? That was weird. So third is metaethics. Metaethics says what really is good or right or, bad, and obviously, or wrong. I'd help if I could spell wrong, not wrong. So metaethics says, well, what do you mean by that's the right thing to do? Utilitarianism? So what? How do you decide that that's the right thing to do? What do you even mean when you say right or good? Are these meaningful terms? Do we all mean the same things? So this brings us to this little introductory lecture. And we get to the fact that contemporary metaethics asks three main questions. So the first of these questions is, what is the meaning of moral terms or judgments? I copied this directly from Wikipedia. I'm not above that. When they say claims or judgments, or terms, they mean claims, right? So if I said something like, it's wrong to steal. Maybe I shouldn't actually, putting an exclamation point there kind of biases us. It's wrong to steal. So I've made a moral claim. It's a moral claim because it's got this wrongness in it, right? It has this concept. Metaethics notices that this seems to have an imperative quality to it. It says what you should or should not do. And descriptive claims about the world that follow this same format, so for example, the cup is on the table, are structurally the same, but they don't have any shouldness to them. They don't tell us what we should do. It's just a description of the world. It's got the, maybe I should have written this out. It is wrong to steal. This sounds like maybe it's describing a fact about the world, but that's not exactly clear. It's got the same structure as the sentence, the cup is on the table, but it has a force to it. It seems to imply that we should do something, whereas the cup is on the table, it doesn't seem to tell us to do anything. Another interesting fact about these two sentences is, let's get them lined up like this. The second sentence, this is either true or false. We call this it's truth apt. We can determine whether or not it's true. For the millionth time, I wish you guys had all taken the Intro to Logic or 102 course so that this would make more sense. But fortunately now, actually, I have uploaded videos onto YouTube, so if you really want to know what this means, let me know, and I'll link you to one of those videos. And maybe you can get some extra credit or something. I don't know. I should bribing people to watch logic videos. I don't know. Is that wrong? We're gonna decide. So, what are the meaning of moral terms or judgments? What is the meaning of a moral utterance, a moral claim? So, we should ask ourselves: can this be true or false? We can also ask: is it describing something in the world? The cup is on the table, follows the same format, but it's describing something in the world. Again, there's a fact of the matter about it. Is the sentence "it's wrong to steal" trying to describe that wrongness is in the world and it's in stealing? Is that what's going on there? Or maybe you think that we're just expressing personal preferences. We're saying something like stealing, ew, right? It's worth noting that ew or yuck cannot be true or false. This is not to say it can't be true or false that you feel yuck about stealing. It's just if somebody says yuck, just in the world, I don't know, maybe they ate some bad milk or something and they just drop it and say yuck. That can't be true or false. I suppose that person could be lying, but the yuck itself is not truth apt. And if somebody genuinely means yuck, they can't be mistaken about that. You couldn't drink some soured milk and shout yuck and somebody be like, are you sure? And I suppose you could change your mind later, but at the moment of feeling yuck, it was just true. This is a view called emotivism that we will explore when we explore more metaethics, but I wanted to give you this little introduction first. Anyway, what should we make of this statement? If you want to say that it's describing something in the world, you're not going to be able to say it's also just declaring a personal preference. You'd be surprised a lot of when you start. I wish we could do this in class because I could ask you guys to share what you think the claim "it's wrong to steal" is claiming. Some of our intuitions are going to be along the lines of, no, there's a fact of the matter about stealing, just like there's a fact of the matter about the cup on the table, and the fact of the matter is, it's wrong to steal. This is called moral realism. Whereas some of you feel like maybe you're just expressing a personal preference, like, I don't like stealing, I disapprove of stealing, or yuck, stealing. And it's going to have always seemed perfectly obvious to you that this is just what moral claims were. And if I could demonstrate this with you, you might be surprised how many of your peers actually take this sentence to mean something completely different to you. And there's a whole host of answers to this question: what is the meaning of moral terms or judgments in between these two positions I've given? Some people think that they don't mean anything. Some people think that they are truth apt, but they're all false. They're all wrong, because moral properties don't exist. So they're trying to describe something that exists in the world, but it's a bit like saying the sentence. Let's add this to our list of sentences. It's a bit like saying Susan is a witch, right? Witches do not exist. And this is why we needed to do philosophy of language before we did metaethics, because those of you who followed along with our philosophy of language Frege lecture will realize because witches don't exist, this doesn't refer to anything in the world, which would mean it's always false. Well, if wrongness doesn't exist in the world, but this sentence is attempting to describe a fact of the matter about stealing, this is also always going to be false. In fact, if we changed it to say, not versus, let's just say, or both of these sentences because when we make these claims, we're trying to describe true things about the world, but rightness and wrongness don't exist in the same sense that witches don't exist, both of these words fail to refer. Therefore, they are both false. This is just an interesting possibility. This is called error theory. So we'll go over a full taxonomy later, but again, I wanted to make sure I took into account your responses to the COVID-19 question before I decided how long to spend on metaethics. So again, apologies for the lateness. But this is just a brief sketch of the sorts of possible answers and the things we will consider when we try to answer question number 1. What is the meaning of moral claims? Metaethics then goes on to say, well, hey, what is the nature of moral judgments? So if rightness and wrongness exist in the world or don't exist in the world, how? How do things get to be right or wrong? How? Well, actually, I suppose that should go on the next one. Are they properties in things? Are they relations between things? Abstract ideas? What exactly are they? And then our third question, you guys can probably tell this is the question I'm predominantly interested in. And guess what? No other intro classes, as far as I know, include metaethics, so this is what you're getting. Anyway, there we go. So number 3, our third question is, how may moral judgments be supported or defended? So I'm probably going to be showing some of my cards to any random people who might happen to view this in saying something like, even if moral properties, whoa, what did I just spell there? Even if moral properties do exist, so the things we were talking about in number 1, if it's describing something in the world, if you say, yes, that's what it's doing, how could we possibly know about them? What about when we disagree? And this is actually a really good question for what is the meaning of moral terms. I actually shouldn't even give that its own line. You'll notice if I say yum broccoli and you say yuck broccoli, and we're just expressing how we feel, neither one of us is wrong about that. We're not in disagreement about how the other person feels. I know that you're yucking broccoli and I'm yumming it. Yes, we feel differently, but we can't actually disagree about it. not at least about how the other one feels. I'm not going to be like, you are mistaken. You do not actually think broccoli is yucky, right? Um, these are just personal preferences, and not the sorts of things we can have substantive disagreements about. Uh, Whereas saying it's right to steal versus it's wrong to steal, we could have what appears to be a substantive disagreement about that. So the problem of disagreement is going to follow us down to how may moral judgments be supported or defended. Do we have some sort of moral detection unit, like uh, philosophers and physicians and basically everybody used to think the spleen did all sorts of weird things uh, in the body. Like if you got grouchy, it might be because your spleen was filling you with ill humors. Do we have something like that in our bodies that just like sense properties of rightness and wrongness in the world? And again, if so, why do so many of us disagree? So, how can we support or defend them? Uh, and that's going to immediately then, number 3, will transition us back to normative ethics. So, this is what we'll be going over in this section. I will be uploading a longer video. Again, mostly we're going to be looking at what is the meaning of moral judgments or moral claims. What do we mean? We will also be looking at moral relativism, which is both a normative position as well as a metaethical position. So some of you might have the intuition that it's wrong to steal is saying something like it's wrong to steal according to your society, or it's wrong to steal in this culture, but it's not wrong to steal in other cultures. So you might think something like that about it. That's a pretty common view. A lot of people have that. But the view has problems. None of these views are without problems. So again, this is just a brief introduction, and expect a lot of resources on this because metaethics is a huge issue to tackle, and I mostly just want to give us a good enough understanding that when we move on to normative ethics, we understand the massive amount of work that goes behind trying to make these normative systems. And then when we go on to applied ethics, which is likely when we'll talk about COVID-19, we understand how slippery and strange it can be when we're not entirely sure what someone is trying to express when they say something like, maybe in the situation of COVID-19, it's wrong to go outside without a face mask, or it's wrong to expose people to unnecessary danger, right? We've probably been hearing a lot of claims like this. Or even the claim like you should obey the law, the new laws. That has that imperative quality to it. That should, that ought. It tries to tell you how to behave in a way that the cup is on the table does not. And we need to understand what we're trying to express when we make these sorts of claims before we can then go on to evaluate them in a normative sense and then evaluate them in an applied sense. So maybe we'll get some COVID-19 discussion up in here. I would love to know, for example, what you think people are trying to express when they say that a behavior is right or wrong. So that's keep that on the table as a possible outcome. Sorry if this was a bit disorganized. Again, I wanted to make sure I accounted for everyone's responses, and some of you wait until the last minute to respond. So cheers, and I look forward to making a much more organized follow-up video overlooking the major different positions on question number 1, what is the meaning of moral terms or judgments. All right, have a good evening, you guys. Have fun.